Hi, I'm the Space Quest historian. Let's get meta for a bit and talk about some adventure game mechanics, because one of the most important aspects of playing an adventure game is being able to, control your main character and have them do shit in the adventure game world. So, in this video, I'll throw out some uneducated observations regarding this topic, and by the end, land on what I consider to be the best adventure game user interface of all time. Let's start with the basics though. Typically, when you think of an adventure game UI, you're probably thinking of one of two things: the Sierra icon bar and the LucasArts 9 verbs. Before then, you had parser games where typing in commands was the order of the day. Now, the parser interface was a relic from the old text adventure days, when on-screen graphics weren't even a thing yet. Games of that era relied much more on both reading comprehension and impeccable spelling to successfully navigate. Well, unless you were tasked with guessing a certain gnome's name, of course, in which case incorrect spelling was apparently part of the challenge, but I digress. Their level of difficulty also tended to be fairly high, not just in terms of devious puzzle design, but also because the very nature of having to tell the game what to do through what were supposedly natural language sentences meant that they had to have a very large vocabulary, and let's be honest, they frequently didn't. The beauty of a parser interface is that you're seemingly given endless freedom to suggest whatever may spring to mind to the game, and the game will then respond to your input. In practice, though, they frequently boil down to guessing whatever verb-noun structure the designer had in mind for a particular puzzle, because, let's face it, you can't predict everything a player's gonna try. Not to mention that they were a bitch to translate for an international market, because that meant not only translating all the on-screen text, but also making sure the parser now understood commands in sentence structures that weren't English. Also, as the 1980s came to a close, the market for computer games was greatly expanding. More and more people were buying computer games at this point, and I don't think it's unfair to say that the degree of computer literacy was also proportionally diminishing. Now, I'm not saying people were stupid or anything, I'm just saying that by the end of the 80s, in a time where computer mice were no longer considered an optional peripheral, people expected to be able to just point at whatever was on the screen and have their character interact with it. Having to type their way through a game seemed cumbersome and old-fashioned, at least to newcomers. Despite this, Sierra actually stuck to their parser roots for quite some time. It wasn't until the release of King's Quest V in 1990 when they first introduced their new point-and-click interface, a good 3 years after LucasArts had introduced their idea of a non-typing interface with Maniac Mansion. The interface in Maniac Mansion is a frankly overwhelming array of interaction verbs. There are 15 in total, which cover far more ground than you'd expect. And while this does make the playing experience more streamlined in that it at least takes away the guessing game of what words a parser might recognize, most of your time playing this game is still spent hunting for the right verbs in the cluttered menu. Sierra took a different approach to the idea of a mouse-driven interface. Their UI consisted of just 4 main interaction icons: walk, look, use, and talk. Walk was for moving your character around the game world, look was for examining objects, use was for whatever the hell it wanted to be really, I'll get into more about that later, and talk was for engaging NPCs in conversations. I actually asked Ken and Roberta Williams about the origins of this new interface, and Roberta replied via email. I designed the interface for King's Quest V, switching from a parser-based interface to an easy-to-use point-and-click interface. I did this to make playing an adventure game more accessible for a larger player base, since many people in those days didn't know how to type or how to communicate with a parser. By switching to an easier interface, more people would be able to play the game without having to struggle. And when I asked her if this was in direct response to the interface LucasArts had introduced with Maniac Mansion 3 years prior, she responded, "The icon interface for King's Quest V had nothing to do with LucasArts. It really only had to do with the fact that I saw that there were many times when I wanted to have friends or relatives try to play my games, and saw that many, like my own mother, had problems trying to figure out how to play my games. That frustrated me enough that I decided that there may be many people not trying to play adventure games because you had to know how to type, and you had to have the patience to try to learn how to communicate with a parser. I saw that many people didn't want to try to do that. It was too hard, and really got in the way of too many to even try to play adventure games. I reasoned that by simplifying the interface, people would more easily get into playing and sticking with it." And And she does have a point. I mean, for my money, it all comes down to a balancing act between giving the player enough freedom to think they have control over their environment without giving them so much freedom that they become overwhelmed. The LucasArts 9-verb interface does, at least on the surface, offer the player more freedom than Sierra's 4 classic interaction icons, by giving them a total of 9 actions to perform. The classic 9-verb system allows you to give, open, close, pick up, look at, talk to, use, push, and pull shit around the game world. Which seems like an improvement over just having one hand icon do most of the legwork, right? Well, not really. Most of these verbs produce a negative feedback response regardless of where you try to use them in the game world because, like Sierra's hand icon, the 9-verb system has a ubiquitous use verb that could mean, well, just about anything. In fact, I'd argue that you could comfortably condense the famous 9 verbs down to just 4: pick up, look at, talk to, and use, and you'd still get the same net result, and here's why. In their endeavor to provide the player with as much ease of play as possible, LucasArts went out of their way to bend over backwards when it came to user-friendliness, so much so that it's exceedingly rare that you'll ever have to use the give, open, close, push, and pull verbs. And even when it comes to handing shit over to NPCs, you rarely have to do anything other than equip the inventory item you want and then click on the NPC. You usually don't have to specifically give them anything. For the most part, using the item on them works just as well. But that's not to say I prefer Sierra's icon bar of just 4 action commands. In fact, I find that to be limiting, to say the least. While you have separate icons for inspecting objects and talking to characters, everything else is accomplished by using the hand icon. In broad terms, it functions exactly like the use verb in the LucasArts UI, in that it just means do something. Do what, exactly? Well, whatever the designers meant for you to do. It could be open, push, fondle, tickle, gently caress, violently shove, and pick up and add to your inventory. The player has no idea what it's actually going to do until they try it out on something. And that uncertainty, at least to me, does not make for good gameplay. The player needs to be in control of the action, and having a single icon perform every other action than looking and talking means that for the most part the player's just simply trying to play a guessing game of catch-up with whatever the designers had intended for them to do. And in that sense, the LucasArts system does offer a greater level of granularity in the actions you can perform, but it comes at the cost of resulting in even more negative feedback for the player. Sierra also seems to have gradually come to the conclusion that their UI was perhaps a bit too limiting because later games in their catalog would add additional icons to the icon bar for various game-specific actions. Leisure Suit Larry added a zipper icon for when you wanted to, do something that involved Larry's nether regions. And interestingly, while most people just consider this the fuck icon, it was also used for various other bodily processes such as urinating. I just thought I'd mention that for no reason whatsoever. On a slightly more wholesome note, Space Quest 4 introduced the smell and taste icons because the 2 guys from Andromeda adamantly refused to adopt the point-and-click interface until they were forced to. So these icons became sort of a catch-all trash bin for all the jokes they would normally have hid behind obscure parser commands. Space Quest 5 introduced 2 different talk icons, one for just chatting to NPCs and the other for bossing them around. The Quest for Glory games introduced a slew of icons for character class specific actions like sneaking or running and, look, I'm not an expert on Quest for Glory. I'm sure all of these mean something. And then, of course, there's the well-meaning but wholly bewildering clusterfuck that is Gabriel Knight's Sins of the Fathers. Now, props to Jane Jensen for having her heart in the right place.
We get letters from people saying they think that the game assumes too much. It assumes that they want to pick up something when they click the hand on it where they may have been trying to open it. So I wanted to try to keep the point and click and the icons, the visuals instead of words, and introduce a little bit more freedom of action.
And I appreciate that, but dear God, look at it. Where do we even begin? You've got 2 talk icons, only one of which is useful, the interrogation icon with the question mark. The other one is just for making small talk with NPCs. You've got the hand icon, which has now been repurposed into being equivalent to the pickup verb in the LucasArts games, which just throws people who've played previous Sierra games for a loop because they keep clicking this thing on in-game hotspots trying to do what the hand icon used to do and keep getting "I can't pick that up" responses. Instead, you've now got this cogwheel icon, which functions as the general use verb, again, with no specific indication as to what use is supposed to mean, and therefore it ends up meaning whatever the other icons don't specifically do. And on more than one occasion, it's even interchangeable for one of the other icons. So I appreciate the idea of giving players more freedom of action, but to me at least, the Gabriel Knight 1 interface is just overwhelming and confusing. The problem here is that you've got all these interaction modes available to you at all times. So not only does it make for confusing gameplay, much like Maniac Mansion was confusing and overwhelming with its 15-verb circus, it also understandably results in a metric fuckton of negative feedback. And you've probably noticed by now that I talk a lot about negative feedback, and I just want to clarify, I'm specifically talking about generic negative feedback. Negative feedback in general is bad, especially when you try something that, at least in theory, should work, but instead you're just giving this generic, I can't do that response. And of course you're going to run into obstacles where something doesn't work right away, but there should usually be a good reason for it, and it should never have to come down to having selected the wrong interaction icon or verb, because at that point, the player isn't solving a puzzle anymore, they're just playing the guessing game of what the designers had intended, instead of using their imagination to overcome the obstacle. But generic negative feedback is even worse, because if something doesn't work and you're just given some standard reusable no-can-do response, you're just left wondering if it's really something you're not meant to do or if you just used the wrong verb. And a lot of times, games will pull this trick on you where you're given a generic response and told that you're wasting your time, when it turns out you're actually on the right track, you just weren't going about it in the way the designers had intended. And the solution isn't to cut down on the availability of actions, because that just means handcuffing that imagination. Nor is simply adding more verbs any better, because then you just end up confusing the player and piling on even more negative feedback. So, no, the standard Sierra and LucasArts interfaces are, in my opinion, flawed, because they don't adapt to whatever situation you, as the player, find yourself in. You have a standard toolkit of available actions, and these actions have to suit whatever obstacles or circumstances you stumble into. There's no wiggle room, there's no imagination required of the player, there's no freedom of action, as Jane so brilliantly put it. And from a designer's standpoint, it's also a thankless task, because if you don't want to rely on generic "you can't do that" feedback messages, you have to sit there and write custom messages for every wrong action the player can take, even ridiculous ones such as talk to door or give false teeth to window. But despite these objections, I don't want it to sound like I just hate these interfaces. Like so many things, they're a product of their time, and you can't just come barreling out of the gate with a fully formed perfect solution to something that's barely even been invented yet. I don't think these are bad UIs by any stretch of the imagination. The games are perfectly playable, and they laid a solid groundwork for what we now call point-and-click adventure games. Hell, Adventure Game Studio still comes with presets for both the Sierra icon bar and LucasArts' 9-verb interface, as well as a couple of other reiterations that came later. And I did have this whole segment of this video dedicated to some of the perhaps lesser well-known approaches and alternatives to these UIs, such as Revolution Software's famous 2-button approach that's still quite popular in indie adventure games. And I might take a closer look at some of these alternative UIs in a future video, if there's any interest in that. But you probably clicked on this video to find out what type of UI I think is the best way to play a point-and-click adventure game with. And it's Leisure Suit Larry 7. No, I'm not kidding. Leisure Suit Larry 7 has the best adventure game UI of all time, and I'll explain why. First of all, it's contextual. When you click on something in the game world, you're given a pop-up menu that displays a number of different interactions. These interactions vary depending on what you clicked on, so you can't do something nonsensical like trying to open a telephone or talk to a plant. Any interaction that's relevant to the given object is predefined, and even if it's not the correct solution, you're still given a valid and unique reason for why you can't perform that action. There's no generic negative feedback. Every action you can perform has been predetermined by the designer, and any action that's not the correct approach will have a plausible, custom reason for why you can't do that. But hold on a minute, I hear you say. What about all that stuff about limiting the player's freedom of action? Sure, we've cut down on generic negative feedback, but what if the player has an idea that's entirely out of left field and isn't covered by any of the predetermined actions? That's where Leisure Suit 11 throws in its trump card. It also has a parser. When you click on something, you're also given the option of typing in your own verb. That is, you're given the opportunity to expand the UI at your own discretion. Now, obviously, this leads to some generic negative feedback, because once again, we now have to contend with people's wild imaginations and potentially their inability to spell things correctly. But Leisure Suit Larry 7 has two important safeguards against this, which admittedly aren't foolproof, but they're as close as you can get. First of all, you're only typing in the verb, as in what you want to do to the given object. Oftentimes with parser games, the reason why players find themselves stuck is because the game not only expects them to describe the action they want to perform on something, but also to identify that something. Look phone, press button, kiss plant, etc. And the point of failure there is often that you end up bashing your head against the wall of what the hell is this game's word for that object? Usually the action itself is pretty easy to define, but if you're trying to open a door and there are multiple doors in the room, you now have to differentiate to the parser which door it is you're trying to open. The Larry 7 parser sidesteps this issue entirely because you already clicked on the object you're trying to interact with, so it only has to keep a synonym list for the various ways you can interact with something, and not an exhaustive list of the many different ways someone could potentially use to describe an object. The other, and even more clever way that the game cuts down on negative feedback is with a trick that Al Lowe, the game's designer, used all the way back when he was designing the first Leisure Suit Larry game in 1987. But you're probably sick of hearing me talk at this point, so I'll just let Al himself explain what that trick is.
We were talking about your question, which I never answered, was how to respond to the parser. I got technical on you, but the real trick that I came up with that was then adopted by everybody else who was writing games was I created a special module that whenever you received the error message, I don't know what to do. You can't do that here, at least not now. Remember that one?
Oh,
yeah,
God.
that horrible. Which
That is such a tease.
Well, that's. I don't know what the noun was. I don't know what the verb was. I don't know what the hell's going on. That's the only message I got for you. Well, when you hit that and everything fell through, and we didn't know noun, we didn't know verb, we didn't know what to do. Then I print up that message. I wrote a module that then stored on a data floppy a line in a text file that gave the scene number, the XY coordinates, the look of the character, look of Ego's. Oh, you know.
Oh,
you know
yeah.
Ego?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Play a character.
Ego's
play a
view number.
Yeah.
In other words, he's got a particular set of animations, and that's, so I want to know how he was dressed in that. And what you had typed, and maybe a couple other flags I can't remember right now, but it would then write that line out to a text file on the floppy, on a data floppy. And then when my beta testers had finished the game, they'd mail me the floppy disk. And then we had 12 beta testers. So I got these 12 floppy disks back and took all those files and loaded them on my hard drive, and then uses DOS concatenate. Who knows that command? Yeah. DOS concat star.txt, I believe was the command. And it took all those lines from all 12 floppies and put them in one big file. Then I used the DOS sort command to sort all those, which put them all in scene order. And then I went through by hand, and I wrote a macro to delete each complete line. So I would just move the cursor down to a line and hit. Oh, that's a duplicate. Those are all duplicates.
Yeah.
And when I was done, I had a list of the things that people had typed that the game didn't understand. And then I went back through each scene and added everything that they wrote and more, if I could, whatever more came to it. But that, and then we did another round and we did that same thing again. And I got lots more feedback. So that's why the parser in Larry 1 worked better. When you were in the bathroom, somebody typed masturbate. and I thought, well, I got to put that in. 2 years later, I was in Hollywood. Somebody wanted to do a show on Fox of Leisure Suit Larry, sitcom. And so they said, well, you've got to show us the game. And none of us here know how to play games. So we'll fly you down here and you play the game for us and show us that. Okay. So I flew down to Hollywood and we're in this big conference room. There's like 20 people there. So my method of doing it was, well, you're here in this bar. I would just say, here's, what can you do here? Well, you can look around. All right, look around. I typed that in, and the game gave a message, and then we did something else. So finally we got in the bathroom, and some guy in the crowd yelled masturbate, and I couldn't remember if I had put the line in or not. And so I said, all right, well, let's see. And the line I put in was, Larry, the whole idea of this game was for you to stop doing that.
Yes. Oh.
And I got a huge laugh, and we never got a contract, though. We never got a sitcom out of the deal, but at least
it was worth it to see a dude in an Armani suit shout masturbate.
For my interpreter parser extension program.
So there you have it. For my money, Al Lowe perfected the adventure game UI back in 1996 with Leisure Suit Larry 7 by giving you all the comforts of a point-and-click game with the added freedom of the parser from Text Adventures. And sure, it doesn't completely eliminate negative feedback, but I never said that was the point. In terms of freedom of action, Leisure Suit Larry 7 gives you all the tools you need to feel like you're in complete control of the protagonist's actions. For the most part, the parser is even completely optional, but it does afford a level of freedom that I can't recall any other game has ever provided, while at the same time cutting down on as much generic feedback as it possibly can within those parameters. I just wish more games had adopted this approach because, well, as far as I know, Larry 7 is the only game that's ever done this. I could be wrong though, leave a comment if there's one that I missed. Also, I'd love to follow up this video with some of the more obscure and bizarre alternatives to adventure game UIs. I'm especially fascinated with those that are completely bafflingly obtuse or just downright awful, like this woefully stupid clusterfuck of a UI in Core Design's universe, or Why I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream has a verb for swallow, despite it only being used once, maybe twice in the entire game, if I'm remembering correctly. I mean, seriously, what the fuck? It's just sitting there the entire game and you almost never use it for anything. It's just taking up space. Anyway, let me know what you guys think are the best and worst ways to play adventure games, and until then, I'll see you around the Chrono Stream. Thanks for coming to my TED Talk. Bye!